Aha! You can see me. It takes so long for this to load sometimes, and you end up with 15, 16 seconds. So, hello everyone. My name is Joseph Solar, and I have a cat on my lap named Stubby who feels in the mood to be cuddly and affectionate. Hopefully, she won't distract you too much from the very, very cool things I'm going to be telling you about. I'm also wearing my Penn Museum staff t shirt. Um, no rescue today, although she's a rescue. Found her in a parking lot. So today I'm going to talk about Florida. I alluded to it earlier, last week, I mean, and had expected to say a few things, but then time got carried away, and I ended up deciding to just put it off for an entire episode of its own because it is so vital and so completely underrepresented in our history books, and it's a travesty. And a representation of Florida fills in a much more richer concept of American history. So, as I do each week, for those who are here for the first time, let me introduce myself. My name is Joseph Solar. I am a professor of history and African American history, which is basically the same thing as you can imagine, just where you focus your eyes. At Rowan College of Burlington County, I'm an adjunct professor, so that means I work on contracts and don't get paid adequately. But my background is this. I received my undergraduate degree from Harvard in History and African American Studies, and then went to Temple University for a PhD and a master's degree in urban education. That means that I am particularly interested in studying the development of school systems and education and history and the interaction of race and gender and other sorts of complicating factors, we will call them, in American history. As with each week, after this video is over, I will provide you links to further information and reading about the topic that I discuss. So, without further ado, please feel free to ask questions in the comments. I will try to answer them live, or if not, I will answer them in the comments afterwards. Still waiting for a haircut, thanks to quarantine. So, let's get started. If I were to ask a great many Americans about the first colony in the United States, I would wager that a great many of them, maybe not all of them, but probably more than half, if not more, would say something like Jamestown or Plymouth or the Mayflower or the Pilgrims. And they'd be wrong. Unambiguously, 100% wrong. The reality is that the oldest city, Colonial city, in the United States of America is St. Augustine, Florida. And it dates back to 1565. In other words, some 42 years before the first attempt at Jamestown, and even 20 years before the lost colony of Roanoke. And what matters about this is that Florida has a very different history from Jamestown and Plymouth. And as some have argued, including Jane Landers and this wonderful historian Rosalind Brooks. Sorry, I don't have her name right in front of me at the moment, but I can provide that to you. If we looked to St. Augustine, or San Agustin, because it was a Spanish colony, as an inspiration for the United States, we would see a very different history, a very different story, and perhaps a more hopeful, diverse origin. So last week I was talking about African sailors and African roles as conquistadores and as explorers of this hemisphere. And this was a very deep underrepresented, unknown, untold, etc. story of the Americas. That going all the way back to 1492 when Columbus first sailed to the Bahamas, among his crew were Africans, likely Congolese, because of what had been by that point a 25-year history of Portuguese Congolese relations down along the African coast. The Kingdom of Congo had converted to Catholicism, and the King of Congo was furnishing enslaved people, ivory, and other trade goods to the Portuguese. And of course, the Portuguese were supplying metal goods and metal work that the Portuguese were able to do. So it was a beneficial trade relationship. Not only that, the Congolese were moving to Portugal. And one of the things I left you with last week was this painting from 1672 of Lisbon showing just how very heavily Africanized the city of Lisbon was. So by the time Columbus is heading across the ocean and he's looking for his sailors to make this journey, he is picking up all the sailors with the experience and the capacity. And what that means, despite the fact that we hear like, oh, he was Italian and he sailed for, Ferdinand and Isabella, his crew was international. I don't have the specific names. I'm not sure those even exist. But we know for certain that there were Aragonese and Castilians, the two major kingdoms that are now Spain. There were probably Portuguese. There might have been others. And there were Congolese. So Africans were among the first people in the Western Hemisphere in this age of exploration, cat hair, to explore the Americas. So continuing on that journey, 20 years, so an entire generation after Columbus's first voyage, a Spanish explorer, conquistador named Juan Ponce de Leon explored Florida. And one of the knights, yes, knights, who was with him was a man named Juan Garrido, who was authoritatively an African. Although, interestingly enough, we know he was African, but he had been sent by his father to study in Portugal. From there, he made his way to Spain. And so this man Garrido is evidence of this continuous interaction between Congo and the Iberian Peninsula. So Garrido helps to explore Florida. And for many years, the Spanish kind of leave Florida behind. Although De Leon's explorations led to the Spanish claiming, I kid you not, Europeans always, they're very bold in their claims of what belonged to them, even though millions of people live there. They claimed a territory called La Florida, which was the state of Florida as we understand it today, but also the entire Atlantic seaboard all the way north. In other words, they claimed all of North America as much as they had claimed South America and Central America. And part of the basis of this claim was this Ponce de Leon exploration with Juan Garrido. And Juan Garrido, of course, would go on with Cortez several years later to help conquer the Aztec Empire and later settle down as a farmer in Mexico and plant wheat and have a large, probably plantation. So the Spanish are brutal. The thing to know about Spanish conquest is the Spanish conquest was a horrifying exercise in brutality, in part because the Spanish were there to spread the Catholic faith, but as part of their Catholic faith, they had a healthy disdain for those who worship the devil. In other words, those people who followed the non-Catholic beliefs of traditional America. And in a practical sense, the Spanish were always outnumbered because of the vast populations that existed in the Americas, and so they used strategic terror to compensate for their personnel shortcomings. And it was, of course, because of the shortcomings in personnel that we know that so many Africans, Catholic Africans, were part of the conquest and were part of these Spanish missions. Actually, Spanish invasions. Spanish missions is a different thing altogether. The Spanish would enslave the native people looking for silver, looking for gold, exploitation, etc. What they didn't find in Florida was gold or silver, and so they largely abandoned the place to focus on Mexico, and then further down by the 1540s into the Andes Mountains in South America and Peru, the conquest of which also, with Francisco Pizarro, involved some African Spaniard Catholic knights. So the brutality of the Spanish was horrifying, so much so that a Catholic friar missionary, Bartolome de las Casas, wrote a book condemning the mistreatment of natives. But he wasn't alone. A lot of Catholic friars condemned the mistreatment, and it led in 1542 to the King of Spain, Carlos el Primero, Charles I, banning the enslavement of Native Americans. It is around that time that King Carlos is banning enslavement of Native Americans that another Spanish conquistador named Hernán de Soto goes back to Florida to explore, hoping to go further and find more gold and somewhere or silver. This was the hunt. De Soto, one of the great unknown explorers, it is likely as well had Africans in his party because he had over 300 soldiers, and we know that the Spanish would draw from any of the Catholic kingdoms willing to supply soldiers, so there were Portuguese with him, and that means they were probably likely some Africans with him as well. The De Soto expedition goes up through Florida, through Georgia, up into South Carolina, up into North Carolina. They cross the Appalachian Mountains into Tennessee, then into Alabama, and then all the way across to the Mississippi River, and then back down the Mississippi River, where they finally end up being liberated. De Soto attempts to plant a settlement in what is today Pensacola, Florida, but it fails. And so what is happening is that in the state of Florida, in what is today the United States, the Spanish are attempting to settle there. And as part of their expeditions and part of their missions, they are bringing alongside Africans. They also would enslave Africans. In fact, that was, a major part of the Portuguese connection, was not just enslaving natives, but enslaving Africans. And after King Carlos bans the enslavement of natives, the Spanish crown and the Portuguese crown turns to Congo for more Africans to enslave and bring over. These Africans who were brought over in slavery have very different experiences than do later enslaved people, in that under Spanish law, enslaved people have the right to buy their freedom. They have the right to convert to Catholicism to get their freedom. They have the right to keep their families. It's illegal to separate families, even if people are enslaved. So you couldn't, if you were married, if you were enslaved and you were married to a free person or to another enslaved person, it was illegal to separate you two. And not only that, enslaved people had the right to sue their owners for mistreatment, to own their own property, to petition the king. In other words, they were still enslaved. Can't set that aside. But the conditions by which they were enslaved provided a great degree of opportunity and freedom in ways that seem shocking when considering that it was enslavement. And so, when 20 years, and again, think of the time period, 20 years after the De Soto expedition into Florida, the Spanish finally decide they need to plant a settlement on the Atlantic coast of Florida because the Spanish treasure galleons bringing all the silver and gold out of Mexico and Peru were constantly being attacked by Spanish and English pirates. And the currents, the coastal currents, meant that the fastest way home was through the waterway between the passageway, if you will, between the Bahamas and Florida. And so the Spanish would frequently come under attack in that waterway from English and French pirates. So San Agustin in 1565 was meant to be a fortress town and a security town so that Spanish treasure fleets could have protection. But San Agustin was not the original location. Where San Agustin is located today was actually further south, because when the Spanish were getting ready to go to put this expedition together under a man named Pedro Menendez de Aviles, they discovered the French had planted a settlement in what is today right near the Georgia-Florida border called Fort Caroline. And so the Spanish are in a race to get there. This initial Spanish settlement force was composed of Catholics. And I can't emphasize this enough, because the Spanish preoccupation was with Catholicism. In part, this might have been a result of the fact that the Iberian Peninsula and those three kingdoms, three major kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Portugal, were connected to Africa. They had been part of the Islamic world, and they had been inherently diverse, but inherently caught up in a religious struggle. And so the perspective on human beings in this part of the world was very different. The Portuguese had trade relationships with Africans, of course, and they brought Africans, they knighted Africans, and Africans were just part of this world so long as they were Catholics. And so this first mission to create a settlement in Florida in 1565 contained Spanish Catholics, Portuguese Catholics, Irish Catholics who had fled from English oppression, and African Catholics. They get involved in the struggle with the French, eventually leading to some horrifying massacres. And again, even when considering these massacres of the French by the Spanish, the reality is that it was religiously motivated, because most of the French settlers were French Protestants. So when we think about these ideas and these beliefs about like race and white and black and all of these issues, it's not the world of the 1560s. That, as far as the account from the Spanish friar who witnessed these events, he spoke about, and I'll provide links to all of this afterwards, he spoke about the massacre of the Lutherans. That from the Spanish perspective, or Pedro Menendez's perspective, right, an African Catholic was a more agreeable person and a better ally than a French Protestant. So there's no idea of like, I'm white and you're black, or I'm this and that. It's like, am I Catholic or are you Protestant? And in fact, when they slaughter all these French Protestants, they actually spare the French Catholics and bring them into the settlement and make them swear allegiance, and then keep them under lock and key, of course. But they make them swear allegiance. And it's all about sharing this faith. And so they begin building this settlement of San Agustin, Florida, on a religious basis and a diverse basis. So the religious foundations might perhaps be problematic, but that's sort of just like Plymouth Plantation, except the religion was Puritanism, whereas in Florida it was Catholicism. But nonetheless, in terms of ethnic and linguistic composition, the settlement of San Agustin, Florida was a broad swath of European and African humans. Now, when they get to San Agustin, Florida in 1565, what they discover is a much less densely populated land than had existed earlier. One of the grave realities of Native American life and death is that between 1500 and 1600, approximately 90% of the native population of the United States dies. European and African diseases that killed lots of Europeans and Africans too, but that Europeans and Africans had some immunity to, completely wipe out 90% of the native population. According to this book, Spanish Pathways in Florida, there were, at the time of the Ponce de Leon expedition, approximately 925,000 native people living in what is today Florida. By the time of the settlement of San Agustin, that number had dwindled to about 10 or 11,000. So we're talking just a horrifying death rate. What's even more devastating is that when Hernan de Soto, went on his big explorations all around, everywhere he went, besides, of course, inflicting terror for his own men's protection, he also spread disease. And so the American Southeast becomes completely chaotic and disrupted places. The Native Americans who lived there and their nations, because they did have nations, despite the history to the effect that they were uncivilized, tribal, etc., these nations are completely thrown into flux by massive depopulation from diseases. And so some that are able to resist the diseases are able to consolidate power or to spread and grow, and others get completely, more or less completely wiped out. When Menendez lands in San Agustin, Florida, he plants a cross and he swears allegiance to God and declares that this land was part of God's country and that it was going to help to bring about the end days by ensuring that the gospel of Jesus was heard throughout the world. So it's part of kind of end days philosophy. They were met by a native people called the Timucuan, who don't exist anymore, although their DNA still exists. But they as a people no longer exist. But the Timucuan welcomed Menendez, and in fact, after having his big ceremony and claiming the land and planting, he actually ordered all of his chefs onto the land, and they had a giant feast at which all of the settlers and all of the natives feasted together. And at least one Florida historian argues that this was actually the first Thanksgiving, and a much more American representation of that Thanksgiving, because at this Thanksgiving feast there were Native Americans, there were free Africans, there were Irish, there were German Catholics probably, there were Spaniards, there were Portuguese. It represented a broad swath of humanity all at one table celebrating the arrival of Catholicism on the shores of Florida. I kid you not. This is insane, but it's true. So San Agustin is difficult. Most of these settlements are difficult. There were some troubles in the relations at first. The Timucuan eventually attack the settlement for reasons not entirely known, and they move the settlement around. But finally, by 1572, the current San Agustin, Florida, is established, where it sits today, that city, just a few miles down from the first settlement. And so what we have is the very first European settlement in what becomes the United States, which means that that is the foundation of the United States. Or rather, it would be the foundation of the United States if we consciously taught it and integrated the events, the lessons, and the circumstances of this settlement into our history. But we do not. The settlement struggles for a while as the outermost outpost of the Spanish Empire. It comes under frequent attack. Once it becomes consolidated, however, the Catholic missions begin to spread into the country. And again, the settlers of San Agustin and Florida are diverse, continuously diverse. So there are new free Africans who move into San Agustin. There are enslaved Africans who move into San Agustin. And then some or many of those buy or sue or somehow gain their freedom and settle down. And not only do they settle down, they intermingle and they marry and they create families together. The Timucuan, and later the Guale, more on them in a second, also will, many of them convert to the Catholic faith. They will marry people, both Spaniards and Africans and Irish and other settlers, and they will create all these mixed families. And so by 1600, even though San Agustin is still a struggling city that's been attacked a couple of times, Sir Francis Drake attacks it, and even been burned a couple of times, it is still this decent sized, by colonial times, diverse city. Using San Agustin as a base, Catholic missionaries spread all throughout Florida, up into Georgia, and into parts of South Carolina, creating missions for the conversion of Native Americans. And this is where the Guale come in, because the Guale people lived in north central Florida and southern and central Georgia, and a great many of them converted to the Catholic faith. To understand what I mean about the missions, I'll just come up with a comparison. In California, on the West Coast, there are all these cities along the coast: San Francisco, Santa Barbara, Ciudad de Los Angeles, right? All these Spanish named cities in California were all missions that grew into cities. So San Francisco and Los Angeles and Santa Barbara and all of them started off as missions. The Spanish do the same thing in Florida and Georgia during the 1600s. And so the Spanish power is actually, even though it's originating and centered around St. Augustine, Florida, is actually spreading north into Georgia and a little bit further to the west into West Florida towards the Mississippi River. And so there are settlements of people in these lands of the Southeast. There is a large Catholic presence, and it is a diverse, ethnically diverse Catholic religious presence. We have hymnals and religious books from this time period written in the Timucuan language. And when we look at these issues and we look at this reality that we don't talk about, one of the great truths that must be kind of held to heart is that this was not just a Spanish enterprise. And what I mean is, it wasn't just Spaniards doing this, that this was an African, Spanish, Portuguese. This was a diverse enterprise. And so, in the American Southeast, among the first settlers, farmers, planters of what becomes the United States of America are Africans. And so, as the book says in a charming way, there's a book called Before the Mayflower, and it talks about the African presence in the Americas. Well, even that book is referring to 1619. And so if you've heard of the 1619 Project in the New York Times, 1619 was the year in which the first Africans were sold, traded really, to the Jamestown colony, marking the beginning of slavery in America. But even that's not entirely accurate, because there were already enslaved and free people, including Africans and natives, because they also enslaved natives who were pagans, savages, etc., already in Florida and Georgia, dating back not just before the Mayflower, but before Jamestown. And so the reality is, Africans are settling and building lives and homes and farming in the United States of America before the English. As one historian puts it, by the time the English plant Jamestown, the grandchildren of the first St. Augustine settlers were in control of society and running society. The grandchildren. So there had been about 2 generations already. And we have completely marginalized this history of the United States. And why? Well, because as the English start rising to power in the 1600s and start planting their own settlements, they will come into conflict with the Spanish. And this will lead to raids and attacks here and there. Not just Spanish pirates raiding and trying to plunder and then burn the city and run. No, not Spanish pirates. English pirates burning, plundering Spanish cities and running, but eventually colonial war. And in 1670, the British will establish the colony of Carolina, centered around the city of Charleston. And now they are close. But again, understand and look at the timing. The Spanish plant themselves in San Augustine, Florida in 1565, and 115 years later, Charleston is settled. What that means, just to put it from contemporary terms, 115 years back from today is the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. And they had just invented moving pictures, and people were just starting to purchase cars, and Franklin Orville Wright invented the airplane 115 years ago, more or less. So we're talking a huge expanse of time in which these Africans, Europeans, and native peoples were constructing these mixed communities and mixed families together and building up settlements. When the Carolina colony is established, enslaved Africans brought to the Carolina colonies experience a very different form of slavery than existed in the Spanish colonies. The English colonies were at this point passing laws which reduced Africans who'd been enslaved to property without rights, without legal standing, without legally recognized humanity, if you will. They could become human if they got freed somehow, but they had no right to purchase their freedom. They had no right to get married. They had no right to maintain their families. And the vice grip, if you will, was being tightened on African lives. And so the Carolina colony was very different from Florida. And so about almost 20 years after the Carolina colony is established, a group of Africans escaped and made it to Spanish Florida. There, the governor, Diego de Quiroga, gave these runaways from Carolina slavery sanctuary. They had to become Catholics and they had to swear allegiance to the Spanish crown. But then they became full, equal subjects, not citizens, subjects, but it's a terrible time anyway, of the Spanish king, on equal footing with any of the Spaniards, pre-existing Africans or mixed people who live there. This becomes the official Spanish policy in the 1680s. The Spanish king Charles II, Carlos II, makes it the official policy of Florida that any escaping Africans who are escaping slavery in the Carolina colony will be granted freedom, sanctuary, and citizenship, subjectship, equal to that enjoyed by any other citizen of Spanish Florida on the condition that they swear allegiance to the Spanish crown and serve in the militia and become Catholics. What that means is that from about 1687 till 1763, some 70 years, there is an underground railroad, as we would think of it, that runs from South Carolina and later Georgia right into Florida. It also means that the Spanish colonies in Florida are increasingly Africanized and with a greater diversity of Africans because, of course, the Spanish had been trading with Congo largely, and so they had West Central Africans. But the English involved themselves in a slave trade running out of West Africa. And so we begin to see greater diversity of Africans coming into the Spanish colonies who further would have left their mark on the culture and life of Spanish Florida. It is as a result of these policies that during the War of Spanish Succession, or Queen Anne's War as it's called, in 1702, the governor of South Carolina launches a punitive expedition against Florida. So he strikes an alliance with the Yamasee native peoples of his area, and they invade Florida and they attack San Agustin. All of the locals are kind of hidden inside the fortress, the Castillo San Marcos, and eventually they defeat this siege by Governor Moore of South Carolina. Moore was humiliated by losing because, of course, people invested in war. He had people who financially backed him, and in exchange, they'd get money back. Yeah, they'd get money back from the plunder. And so Moore, feeling angry at himself and having to satisfy all his investors, launched a campaign of terror through the rest of Florida and into the Georgia backcountry, during which he destroyed all of the Spanish missions he could find, and he enslaved all of the natives of the missions, as well as all the Africans who might have been living in these mission towns. According to his accounts, Governor Moore himself carried off into slavery some 5,000 Native Americans, mixed people, African Americans, from his plunder of the missions. What this plunder of the missions did, besides destroy the Spanish presence and also destroy, in a sense, the memory of the Spanish presence, was tantamount to genocide. The native population had, of course, been commingling and intermarrying for sure, which diluted their kind of unique cultural identity, but the ongoing battles with disease had led to a gradual reduction in native population, and of course the Timucuan people, the Guale, and others of northern Florida, southern Georgia ceased to exist as independent, coherent entities as a result of Governor Moore's raids. It has been described by some survivors or descendants of survivors today as ethnic cleansing, as genocide, as cultural genocide, as extermination. And so this is how we will lose some of that memory of the Spanish presence. But again, every time I say the Spanish presence, please be aware that I speak of a Spanish flag presence, but that the people who were this Spanish presence were a New World society, a society composed of diverse Europeans, increasingly diverse Africans, and the surviving populations of Native Americans who converted to Catholicism. The Yamasee people themselves would find their way on the wrong side of the English. But here's where things get interesting, because there was an enslaved Mandingo child who will later be called Francisco Menendez, who had escaped slavery in South Carolina and had gone to live with the Yamasee, during which time he learned a great deal about the Carolina, Florida, Georgia countryside, learned the languages. He was a polyglot. He spoke multiple languages. And eventually, during the Yamasee War of 1715, which happens right at the end of the Queen Anne's War, he will become a captain of the Yamasee military that goes to war with these English encroachers. Because basically the English refused to honor their part of the bargain they had made with the Yamasee in exchange for the Yamasee alliance, etc. And so we will have this Yamasee War from 1715 to 1717. After it's over, Francisco Menendez, which likely was not his name yet, flees to San Agustin, and he becomes a Spanish subject, a Catholic, and an officer in the Florida militia. And so we have, there might have been other evidence, there might be other people, but we don't have a lot of evidence because people didn't even begin to look at these issues until the last 20, 30 years. But we know for certain that Francisco Menendez, a Mandingo from West Africa, will be a captain in the Florida militias by the 1720s. And as tensions continue to rise, he will be one of the first leaders of the first legally sanctioned free black community in America. In 1738, the Spanish governor, citing overpopulation issues in San Agustin and desire among many of the increasing inflowing West Africans to have their own community, will commission the creation of Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mosé, also called Fort Mosé, which is the first free black community in America, the first kind of like legally established free black community, because of course there had always been refugee communities and escapee communities in the swamps and the woods and whatnot. And so Fort Mosé becomes this giant free black town. And we have evidence from drawings of the people who live there that this was a community that, because it was composed of more recent arrivals from Africa, actually retains a great deal more of its African traditions, even as it is officially a Roman Catholic town with churches and the whole nine yards. And so we see kind of facial markings and decoration and whatnot that is a direct connection to the West African homeland where many of these people had come. So Fort Mosé will be a bulwark. The following year, there's a major revolt in South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion, led by an Angolan. We don't know if he's Congolese or Ndongolese, named Jemmy. And this South Carolina revolt was aimed specifically and directly at getting to Fort Mosé to freedom. And so by the 1730s, a large portion of the Florida militia, military leadership group is African. And the English are constantly angry and upset because this community, this free, relatively powerful community, was a constant inducement for enslaved laborers in South Carolina and the newly established colony of Georgia to escape south. In the 1740s, England and Spain are at war again, and the governor commissions the Georgia governor, Oglethorpe, to punish these escaping communities, and there is more war and conflict. And the governor of San Agustin, the governor of Florida, orders that Fort Mosé be evacuated, and the entire population flees to San Agustin, where they're able to once again withstand another siege, and Governor Oglethorpe is forced to withdraw. Fort Mosé was ruined, and that free black population from Fort Mosé just integrates into San Agustin, and they grow San Agustin bigger. The Spanish had managed to hold Florida for years, but in 1763, as a result of a treaty, Fort Mosé and all of Florida is given up to the English. the free black population of Florida leaves. They flee to Havana. And in fact, Menendez will lead his people, if you will, his people, to Havana to escape. 3,900 people will leave Florida. A huge number of them Africans. At this point, African Spanish or Afro-Floridians or whatever you want to call them. And they move to Havana. The English will then bring English-style slavery to Florida, and they will begin importing Africans who are living as property and chattel to help build the two colonies of East and West Florida. When the Revolution breaks out, East and West Florida are the 14th and 15th colonies. And again, we don't talk about Florida, but the reality is, during the American Revolution, there are 15 American colonies, plus Canada. But East and West Florida remain loyal. And so thus we kind of write them out of the history books. They don't exist because they were loyalist. And because in 1782, a Spanish general, Bernardo de Galvez, will invade West Florida at Pensacola. And with a gigantic force, again, of Spaniards, French Catholics, African Catholics, Afro-Cubans, Afro-Floridians, everybody in that Catholic-speaking world, he will lay a 2-month siege and he will conquer all of West Florida during the American Revolution. And so when the war is over, Florida is given back to the Spanish. Immediately, Africans begin fleeing from Georgia into Florida. It becomes such a, quote, problem that the first U.S. Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, will write a letter to the King of Spain telling him that if they want to maintain the friendly relations that exist between the United States and Spain, they'd better stop this policy of providing sanctuary to runaway slaves. And so officially they do. But that doesn't stop Africans and African Americans from running to Florida. And in fact, during this time period, they will flee into the swamplands where the remnant Yamasee and mostly the Seminole Nation have swelled in power. And so there will be a population called the Black Seminole who are hundreds, if not thousands, of these descendants of runaways who flee to Florida from roughly 1790 to around 1815 or so. So about 25 years. They flee to Florida and become part of the Seminole Nation. During the War of 1812, one of the first things the United States does, actually in the early going before the War of 1812, they invade Florida to try to seize Spanish ports because they're worried that those ports will be used against them, because for the first time in history, or first time in 300 years, the English and Spanish are allies again. And so they invade Florida again, and again, the resistance to American encroachments on Florida is led by Seminole, Black Seminole, meaning African Seminole, and of course, a small population that had returned from Cuba to Florida after the reacquisition of Florida by the Spanish crown. And so Africans are fighting in Spanish military uniforms against the Americans in 1811 and 1812. And then there is this, eventually, the Seminole War. So Florida in this time period is in chaos because the Spanish crown can't supply it or resupply it or control it because of the revolutions in the Spanish-speaking world. Mexican Revolution, the South American Revolution. And so the Florida economy is kind of chaotic and messy. Americans are moving to Florida and settling in there. And just like they do in Texas, they move to Florida and they immediately try to flip Florida to the American column. And so eventually, in 1821, a treaty is signed, Adams-Onis, in which the Spanish give Florida to the United States, at which time the Black Seminole, large numbers of them, not all of them, large numbers of them will flee Florida again and move to the Bahamas, and large numbers of free Afro-Floridians will leave for Cuba or other parts. Or some, again, we're still trying to unwind all of this history, will flee into the countryside and swamps. It takes another 15 years before the United States is able to, quote, pacify the Seminole and the Creek Nation, including a great number of Africans. And so as a result, today, the native peoples of Florida, the descendants of the native peoples, are very clearly people of native and African and European blood, because there was so much commingling of people. And this Florida, this diverse world where Africans, Europeans, and natives mostly coexisted. There were wars between various native structures, but San Agustin, this town built through the commingling of African Europeans and Native Americans, is largely wiped out of the history books, because in the context of trying to maintain a system of chattel slavery that the United States does, it is a very, dare I use the phrase, inconvenient truth to know that Europeans, Africans, and natives could live together, could fight together, could build a society together for so many years. Because, in fact, as there's a documentary that is inaccessible at the moment, but I'll link to it. The Spanish flag flew over Florida for more years than the American flag has. Once we hit the year 2055, then the two flags will have flown over Florida for the same amount of time. So we're about 35 years short of reaching the same duration of culture and civilization in Florida that the Spanish had there. And so when we look at American history, we have to acknowledge that there was a model of how it could have been done differently, that we didn't have to turn to chattel slavery. We did not have to turn to exclusionary ideas of white and black, that we could have found ways to coexist, because right in Florida for some 200 years, that is what the Timucuan, the Guale, Congolese Africans, Mandingos, English, well, a few English, but mostly Irish, Spanish, and Portuguese Catholics had managed to do, and managed to do so in a way that they resisted continuous invasions from the English. So, I will leave it at that. I have piles of links to post up for you all. But in the meantime, are there any immediate questions I can answer for anybody? I will leave it up a minute for you to ask questions. But boy, I have got links, because Florida is mind-blowing, their history. Oh, I didn't track all the way down. There might be questions that I missed already. Thank you, Jay. Okay, so 2 questions from Lynn. Were there other free communities like Fort Mose? So the thing about Fort Mose specifically, why it's special, is that it was a community specifically for Africans born in Africa who had escaped from the Carolinas and fled to Florida. Because generally speaking, San Agustin, Florida, was a free community. It was just not exclusively African. It was, in fact, diverse and mixed between Europeans, Africans, and native peoples. And San Mateo, another settlement that existed. So there's multiple settlements along the Florida coast during the mostly the 1600s, where Africans and Europeans and natives are coexisting and building community together. The documentary, Jay, is called Secrets of Spanish Florida, and I will provide the link to it when I do the kind of post-video wrap-up. Any other questions? I think it's very huge and very important to know that, again, African people were part of the foundation, the settlement, yes, even the horrifying bits of bloody conquest of the Americas. In other words, they were a part of the story. They were the original American colonists. So the Jamestown story of a bunch of Jamestown English people and then suddenly Africans show up in 1619 is completely not non-representative, but it's completely beside the point. It is a part of the story. It is not the story. And the idea that we present Jamestown as the story, I agree with you, Jay. Florida, man. Woof. The idea that Jamestown is the foundation of America. No, Jamestown is one foundation of America. Plymouth in Massachusetts is another foundation of America. And San Agustin, St. Augustine is the third other major pillar of America. And between those three colonies, the people who live there, the struggles and the ideas, we see three different, sometimes contending images, sometimes complementary images of what our country could be, could have been, might have been, had we made choices differently, and also were we more fully aware of our deep history and the identities of all the people who came to these shores and the things that they did here for some 450, more or less, 450 years. Alrighty. Any last questions? Feel free to comment after the video's over, but I'm going to be just popping up links like crazy right after this is done. All right, I'll give you 20 seconds to ask a last question. In the meantime, I'm going to get ready to post links galore. And always remember, when you read some of these stories and they say the Spanish, the Spanish, the Spanish, remember that the Spanish were not just people who were ethnically born in like Madrid. That the Spanish were people under the Spanish flag, and that a significant number of these, going all the way back to Columbus, were Africans. Alrighty, that's it for today. Yeah, the English were terrible, but so were the Spanish. I mean, the one thing to take heart from, Jay, is that when we look back at history in these past worlds, as disturbing, troubling, kind of heart-rending as some events of the contemporary days are, we as a species on this planet have actually become less cruel to each other than we used to be. I think what's notable is that the English based their cruelty and barbarism on whether you were English or not, right? The idea of nationalism or ethnicity, which is of course part of racism, whereas the Spanish based it on religion, Catholicism versus not Catholicism, which in a sense is part of religious bigotry and fundamental cruelty as well. It's just the Spanish eventually grew out of it. Eventually. But nonetheless, they were viciously cruel people, and even Native Americans played their own role in exterminating their own neighbors. The Yamasee people themselves were significant in those raids that wiped out the missions, only to see themselves wiped out 10 years later and scattered all throughout Florida. The Yamasee Nation still exists today as a reconstituted nation, but they were lost to history for 150 years because they lived in hiding. And the Yamasee people, like many others, have a significant quantity, if you will, of African blood because they would shelter and adopt and marry in with the Africans who lived among them, not just the Europeans. Alrighty, I'm going to call it a day. Look for links. There is so much out there, so much to be studied in Florida. It blows my mind. It also makes me want to go visit the place, although once the epidemic is over. So all the best to everyone. I will see you next week. Not sure what the topic's going to be, but we'll figure it out. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.